Yeah, it may not have picked up on some of the erosion and accretion that's been documented and observed, but it does a pretty good historical snapshot of shoreline changes in general. So good work.
Yeah, the only thing that the thing that bothered me the most is when you zoomed way in, everything appeared at an angle and the little lines moved onto the Rice Ave. It was, but most of it was great, and appreciate it.
Loretta has a beautiful sunset.
Yeah, I can't take credit for that. That's Ricky's.
Beautiful.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment. I have to forward a link to one of our presenters. So I will resume sharing in just one moment.
Okay. Okay. Just to let the participants know, we are currently live on Revere TV. And I'm also sharing a link here. Okay. Let's see if we have pretty points here. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think we'll probably get started now and allow others to join us as we get going. So this is our second workshop for our second public workshop for the coastal resiliency study for the Riverside and the Point of Pines neighborhood. The project is made possible, of course, with the support of Mayor Brian Arrigo, and I'd like to also personally thank Carolyn Mecklenburg with the MVP Action Grant. She's our regional resource, and she's been a wonderful help throughout the process and throughout the project through the MVP Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Planning Session, as well as through this action grant process. So thank you for being here. You can give us a wave so everyone knows who you are. And I'd like to actually welcome everyone here on the project team and all of the participants to the group. Thank you for taking your time out of your evening. I especially want to thank the project partners who have taken the time to review countless documents as have come through over the past few weeks, and also to thank our consultants, AECOM. We have Aaron Wyneth with us and his team, and he'll be introducing them just shortly. So just a few housekeeping items. This is a webinar format, so if you are an attendee and you're in the audience, if you have a question or would like to make a comment, I would just ask you to look at the bottom of your screen, and there is a raised hand function. I just ask you to click on that, and we will call upon you to ask your questions or to provide any feedback that you have. I'd also like to introduce some of our staff that we have on board. We have Frank Stringiu here with us, our Revere City Planner, who is no stranger to the resiliency planning in our community. We also have Paul Argenzio online, if he wants to give us a wave. I'd also like to introduce the Director of Planning and Development, Robert O'Brien, has also joined us this evening. And we also have a number of stakeholders with us on the project team as well. So you can look on the screen here, and it just shows you how many people have been involved in this process from the onset, and how many people have been taking time to either attend meetings or review documents or provide feedback as needed. As I said, this is a webinar format, so if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand. I believe Aaron will be presenting the slides, and if possible, would like to get through the slides and then hold questions in case they may be addressed in later slides. If there is a burning question, by all means, let us know, and we will certainly call upon you. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Aaron as we get rolling. And thank you all again for coming this evening.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Elle, and for everyone who's participating tonight. Looking forward to sharing an update with you on this really important and exciting study that we have been supporting the city with. So this is the agenda. Basically, the overall purpose that we are here tonight is to present findings from some of the early deliverables for the project. So it's primarily looking at assessing the current and future conditions, identifying short-term resilience measures, and also looking at the development of a coastal resilience toolkit that we have been starting to work on. And then also seeking some input from you on some feasibility criteria that we'll be applying to some of these interventions to understand, how real applicable they are for various portions of the study area. As Elle mentioned, we'll try to move through the formal presentation as best we can and hold most of the discussion toward the end. But as Elle mentioned, if there's something that really hits you, you have a key question on, we'll field those as we can, and just want to be respectful of everyone's time too. So we'll try to be quick with the delivery, but take our time enough to tell you what we feel is worth noting, and then we'll open it up for the most important part, your feedback toward the end. And I am accompanied by several of my colleagues, some of the project team. I'll introduce them as they present their material. So to start, I won't go into detail in this, this memo that was developed because it has been presented to the project partners before. But basically, the purpose of this was to review past reports related to coastal resilience relative to the city, and in particular, of the study area. There's been a lot of work that's been done in the past, some ongoing work that's very relevant. So this is basically, we wanted to convey that we have been taking and leveraging the available information, building upon what's been done before, and coordinating with those ongoing projects. So this slide captures several of the studies. Most recently, in 2020, this Route 1A corridor vulnerability assessment, but as you can see, this has been looked at for decades. Down at the bottom of the screen, the last bullet here is a U.S. Army Corps flood damage reduction study for the Saugus River and tributaries that was conducted in 1990. you'll see a graphic here showing the solutions that were proposed at that time. It was kind of a series of structural and non-structural measures to provide regional coastal protection. And this is getting kind of a breath of new life. It's being revisited and comes into play when we're thinking about not just what Revere can do, but the importance of looking at some of these issues as a region. And that'll come into play in our discussion later in this presentation. As I mentioned, there are some ongoing or very recently wrapped up studies. The top item being the Riverfront Master Plan was approved earlier this year. This is looking at a portion of the study area, looking at redevelopment opportunities as well as stormwater management. We've been provided with the reports from that, been connected to the engineering team that has been facilitating that work and coordinating efforts on that part. There's also looking at development of a neighboring property, looking for a possible boating facility for the community. And then also one of the project partners for us, the Department of Conservation Recreation. They're just getting underway a vulnerability assessment for the nearby Revere Beach Reservation. So it's great having DCR as part of our project partners, and we can kind of get updates from them as they make progress and as it's relevant to the work that we're doing in the Point of Pines and Riverside area. Also, as part of this initial first deliverable, again, there were projects that were done in the city of Revere, but there's also been a lot of great work done elsewhere here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and across the nation as it relates to coastal resilience and climate change considerations. So we identified some case studies that we thought were particularly relevant and could help inform the work that we were doing. The studies that we identified are presented here on the slide. One that I thought I would just note is Breezy Point in New York. This was really a very similar peninsular type of community that was looking at building some resilience against coming back from Superstorm Sandy. So there were some recommendations and options that were presented in that study that are pretty relevant to what Revere is facing now and is projected to be facing in the future. So again, without going or belaboring the details of all these studies, this was a memorandum that was put together to document all the great work that's been done by the city and other project partners in the past, as well as drawing from national and local examples to help inform our work. But now I want to get a little bit more into some of the technical work that we've been doing as part of this project. And I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Ricky Torres-Cuban, who is a climate science specialist and a coastal engineer. And he's really been helping lead our climate science and vulnerability assessment memo. So Ricky, with that, it's yours.
Thanks, Aaron. The first step of this process was looking at the climate science. This was basically a literature review looking at the studies that have been done in the most recent science for the area. Luckily, Massachusetts and the Boston area, there's a treasure trove of studies that have been done here. There's a lot of data available, which really facilitated this process. We were focused on looking at temperature and precipitation and sea level change and coastal flooding. The temperature and precipitation are not really the focus of this, but we thought it would be important to include this since that data is available and certainly will affect the community in different ways. So some of the results of that are shown here. There's changes to the 10, 25, and 100-year precipitation event that are shown there in that bar graph. And that's from the Cambridge Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. There's also some layers here shown from the Massachusetts Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flood Viewer. So this is just showing different feet of sea level rise from 1 feet to 6 feet. And this is just above mean high water, or like the regular sort of daily high tides. This is sort of a good figure to have in the back of your mind, since as you can see, once you get to about 3 feet of sea level rise, most of the residential areas here are really are inundated, and so the focus that we get into later, we'll be looking at with that specifically. Also, the temperature, some temperature information is included here, but I'm not really going to go into that right now. We can go on to the next slide. Oh, can we get the, yeah, there it is. As a part of this, we also wanted to identify critical assets to the city and state. So we were looking, first of all, at sort of flood risk reduction structures, so seawalls, rock revetments, and where those are located, also dunes. Then we were looking at, as you can see here, a variety of different types of assets, some key ones sort of to flood protection in the area, the pump station. Obviously, the fire station is very important, the wastewater pump station, and then the various outfalls and tide gates and culverts as well. This analysis, luckily, there aren't an absurd number of assets here, so it was fairly straightforward to put all these together and include them in the study. And we can move on to the next slide. So the first step here was to look at existing vulnerability. And for this component, we focused on stormwater and groundwater erosion, coastal erosion, and then also coastal flooding. So for stormwater and groundwater, there isn't really modeling available, so we aren't able to show you floodplains or anything like that. But we were able to speak with many of the local folks at the city, and we have been told that stormwater is a fairly important issue. We included this map here that we're showing with the low-lying areas. So unfortunately, you get sort of a double impact here because the groundwater table is fairly high, and it's pretty much influenced by the surrounding coastal waters. And then, when there's precipitation, that sort of adds to the problem of the groundwater. And so, as we were told, some areas sort of throughout this area can be flooded, and the flooding can sometimes take a long time to clear away, just because the pump station there is obviously only able to operate effectively when the tides are low enough. So that's an important sort of issue to point out for existing vulnerabilities associated with stormwater and groundwater, although we don't really have quantitative information on that. Secondly, erosion. We looked at sort of erosion, the Massachusetts Shoreline Change Project, which gives kind of a broader overview. According to their data, all of these shorelines are fairly stable. But again, speaking with sort of local sources and looking, at some of the shorelines and information that they have available there as well, it's very clear that there is erosion taking place in some areas, particularly along sort of Mills Avenue on the Pines River side, and then also down by Cary Circle, where sort of the wave energy seems to be concentrating and causing some erosion. Then there's also notably accretion sort of on the northeast side there, where the beach is kind of growing. And then also, yes, along the northern edge there as well, coming along the Saugus River. So some shoreline change issues that are important to acknowledge. And then finally, coastal flooding. We looked at the probability of flooding and then also pathways of flooding. So you can see from the photo here, this is just from September of this past year, flooding on Mills Avenue. This is an issue that already exists. It doesn't even necessarily take any kind of special flood event to cause flooding in this area. So, just wanted to acknowledge that here, and then we'll be going into more detail, primarily based on the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to take a moment here to sort of address flood exceedance probabilities. This can be somewhat confusing for people. So again, the main source of our data here is the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. This is hot off the presses. This is the cutting edge of modeling, really, for future conditions. Honestly, you guys are lucky to have this at all. Most of the country doesn't even have anything close to this. So it's exciting to have this. And it really adds a lot of information to this study and allows us to give you, more detailed information about what we're looking at here with the risk. Just to be clear, when we're talking about these flood exceedance probabilities, it's giving you the annual chance that a particular location will be inundated by some coastal floodwaters. This could be a combination of storm surge and riverine, or there's sort of a variety of events that could cause this. And as is shown here, the way this is calculated is basically they simulate hundreds to thousands of storms, hurricanes, nor'easters coming in from just different directions. And they select these events sort of to capture the full spectrum of possible events that might occur in the area. And then they're able to generate probabilities based on all of those events and how they played out for the local area. So as you would imagine, higher probability areas are at greater flood risk. That means it's more likely that they will be flooded for any given year. Low probability areas are less likely to be inundated. So that means it would take a much bigger flood event. So like 100-year or 500-year, a big event of that nature. And so the example I have here, just to clarify, so if we talk about 1% annual probability, that's 0.01 is the actual probability there. And so that's equivalent to like a 1 in 100 annual chance that area, that a flood that either equals or exceeds the value necessary to flood this area would occur. And some people think of this again as sort of the 100-year event, or once the annual recurrence interval being 100 years. But though thinking of it as a 1% annual chance is probably the best way, since it's just because it's a 100-year storm doesn't mean it's going to occur every 100 years. Next slide. So this is the present day. So this is from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model again, which was, I forgot to mention, developed by Woods Hole Group in partnership with Mass DOT, as you can see there. So this is for existing conditions. We do have maps sort of for the entire area, but this is zoomed in because this is kind of where a lot of, obviously the residential and other critical assets are located. You can see the different colors. So the yellows and the oranges, so those are lower flood risk probability. So those are areas where you would need, 100-year or greater level of event to flood them. But as you can see, most of the areas don't really require a storm of that magnitude. A lot of these are more in the, 10 to 50%, and even higher in certain areas. So we pointed out here, you can see there's some arrows and a circle. When we were talking about the pathways of flooding, we wanted to see in existing conditions, which areas are the most flood prone. And so you can see here the two arrows on the right, the two red arrows. There's a flood wall or a seawall, sorry, that's along this coastline that is not well represented. In fact, we spoke with the folks at the MCFRM, and although the East Coast on Rice Ave, that wall and those dunes and all that is included in the model, they did not include that wall that's up there because it was sort of too low for the 100-year event, which was the focus of that study. So it's important to note that some of these areas, the flood risk is probably being exaggerated a little bit, but these areas are certainly in danger, and that is still the lowest lying area. So that is an important flood pathway that we wanted to point out. Then also up where we were showing the pictures earlier, over by Thayer and River Avenue, at Mills Avenue, currently flooding, definitely an issue. It's in orange there just mostly because the flooding doesn't really spread out quite as much as it does over on this north side over here. Finally, down on Rice Ave in the circled area, that is flooding that is primarily due to sort of overtopping run up, so waves crashing against the wall there along Rice Avenue and then spraying back onto the residential areas behind. So it's not a direct flood pathway, but it is an important area where flooding does occur. Next slide. There was just one more spot that we wanted to point out as well here in Mills Ave, where flooding, if it does get high enough, can definitely spread quite a bit, particularly along the east side where it's a little more low lying. Next slide. So for future conditions, we looked at the same three sort of categories: stormwater, groundwater, erosion, and coastal flooding. Stormwater and groundwater, as we were saying, groundwater is primarily influenced by the surrounding coastal waters. So as the sea levels rise, unfortunately, the groundwater table will also rise. Secondly, the stormwater, there were some tables, as you saw at the beginning. There will probably be increases to the precipitation, but again, that wasn't really the focus here, so I'm not going to go too much into that right now. Same with erosion. It would require sort of modeling to really know how that's going to change exactly, but it's likely that with increased sea levels, some of these issues could be exacerbated and possibly new areas and different dynamics there. What I will talk about in more detail, though, is the coastal flooding. So here I have a table showing sort of approximate timing of permanent inundation. So on the top, there's the figure there that shows, so there's a lot of lines. We've got intermediate low, intermediate high, high and extreme. So those are all the NOAA, the most recent NOAA sea level rise predictions for the coming years for sea level rise. This is for Boston specifically. Then the sort of horizontal lines that we have there, those just are marking the MCFRM values that they have. So some of the slides we're going to show here in a second show 2030, 2050, 2070. So those have very specific sea level rise amounts associated with them. And so those are marked there as well. So just using those, the NOAA values and sort of the NOAA projections for the timing for these things, we developed this table here to show sort of possible timings for the 1, 2, and 3 feet of sea level rise. You might recall I pointed out a little bit earlier when we were looking at that image from the Massachusetts sea level rise viewer, that once you get up to 3 feet, most residential areas have been inundated. So we kind of capped it there as far as sort of a relevant thing to talk about here. As you can see, the earliest, so this would be the extreme scenario. We're looking at 2025, which is obviously very soon for 1 foot, and then 2048 for 3 feet. Intermediate, which is sort of the middle of the road, like arguably more realistic, we're looking at 2040, 2063, 2084. And then the latest, which is the intermediate low scenario that we included here, the 3 feet doesn't occur until well after 2100. Also, I should point out that there was a comparison done of existing infrastructure, the seawalls, to future flood levels, but we're not really going to go into that right now. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Yep. So just to go through these, again, it's the same color scheme. So the reds and yellows are sort of the least likely to flood. And then as you get closer into the greens and then into the darker blues, it sort of is more and more common up to the point where, you're expecting this area to flood at least once a year. So as you can see, 2030 things are already pretty bad. It's fairly high probability of flooding for most of the residential areas. Although, some of the higher areas here, like the adult daycare center that's there, seems like it's still pretty dry. We can go to the next one. So 2050, here you can see that the flooding is pretty widespread, and the numbers, the colors are probably hard to see here, but just understand that it is, the probability does sort of increase as the sea level rise increases. So, you know, the colors are getting darker, unfortunately, and the chance of flooding is increasing. So 50% is once every 2 years of flooding. Then 100% you would expect it to flood at least once a year. So just to give an idea here, and then we can flip through to 2070. Again, not a whole lot to say here other than, you know, obviously it's pretty bad. And the next slide here, we some, I guess, major conclusions here to point out are just, you know, within 40 to 60 years, we're looking at, you know, large areas it's predicted would become inundated daily by high tides. Then also the 4 coastal flood pathways that were identified. These are areas where the shoreline is vulnerable and where sort of short-term flood protection measures could be put into place and would be most effective. And finally, there are structures that are currently in place, and some of them are more effective than others, and they all sort of lose some effectiveness over time, but particularly on the northern side and on the Pines River side, they lose a lot of their sort of flood protection or flood risk reduction capabilities as the sea levels are rising. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Ricky. That was a lot of information. I think you did a good job trying to break down the concepts. And I'm sure there will be some questions when we get through later, but I'm hoping that we can keep on moving through to the next topic. And the next topic is looking at short-term. Did someone raise a hand? Thought I heard some feedback. The next topic is looking at short-term resilience measures that we've been looking at. And the person from our team who will be presenting this information is Kira Murphy, who is a structural engineer with AECOM. And I will turn things over to you, Kira.
Great, thanks, Aaron. So like Aaron said, in this segment of the presentation, I'm going to go through some of the short-term resilience measures that we've proposed for the project site. And in order to choose what measures would be applicable, we created this list of screening criteria. So starting with geometric constraints, we looked at the max height of the barriers. For coastal loading, as you can see on the image to your right, the project area, the majority of it is either in an AE or VE FEMA coastal flood zone, which means there'll be coastal loading and coastal wave action. And therefore, we wanted to look at different measures that were able to withstand that type of loading. The structural system, we consider that some of the measures may need an additional structural foundation, offsite storage and deployment. Any measures that are deployable will need a secondary location where they'll be stored 99% of the time. And then, of course, visual impact, the day-to-day aesthetic impact on the community, for anyone visiting. You could move to the next slide, Aaron. Great, so once we established these screening criteria, we looked into 2 main categories of temporary measures. The first category is short-term deployable measures. So these measures require, like I just said, a secondary location where they'll be stored. They also require a deployment team and an implementation plan. So this will be these will be the people who physically deploy the barriers in the event of a storm, and the plan will have full instructions on how they will do that and timing as well before a storm. The biggest benefit of this type of measure is that they have a very, very low visual impact because you do not see them on a day-to-day basis. And as you can see in the images below, there are a wide variety of different types of deployables available. Starting at the top left, we have aquafence, and these are foldable panels that you stand up and you align them next to each other to form a layer of protection. Underneath that, we have stop logs, which are aluminum logs that are stacked up between intermediate posts. Then on the top right, we have tiger dams, which are inflatable tubes. and the tube wall system, which are also inflatable tubes. The difference between these two systems, the Tiger Dam and the tube wall, are one is filled with air and one is filled with water. And so there are wide varieties. You can see materials and types of deployables available that all protect against flooding. And then the second category we looked into is on-site measures. So these you set up on site, and once you set them up, that's it, you leave them there. There's no deployment before a storm. These measures are always on site. Obviously, what comes with that is they have a significant impact on a day-to-day visual aesthetic because they are out there in the community. And these measures are typically earth-filled structures that are stacked to achieve a desired level of protection. And they vary in complexity from a sandbag wall to woven pentagon-shaped trap bags, or something more complicated like the geotextile defense cells, or HESCO barriers, which are canvas bags. And all the measures that we looked at are summarized in this table and broken down based on those screening criteria that I went through. So starting on the left side of this screen, we have each resiliency measure, and the ones highlighted in gray are the first type, the deployable measures, and then the ones on the bottom in white are the on-site measures. So we looked at their max height. So as you can see in this column, they range in capacity from as low as 20 inches up to some of them 14 feet, depending on what kind of level of protection you need. The majority of them work in coastal loading, with the exception of only 2. Most of them don't require an anchor system, but depending on the height you're looking at and the loading, some will require an additional anchor system. For storage and deployment, all of the gray, the deployable structures need secondary storage, while the white on-site structures do not. For visual impact, all the deployable options have a low visual impact because they will be stored separately, and then the on-site structures have a much higher visual impact. As far as cost, we broke down a high-level material cost per linear foot. The cost option varies significantly depending on the max height you're looking to achieve with the barrier. So that will be dependent on the specific location. Great. So next we looked at, now that we have our list of potential options, next we looked at where these temporary measures can be located within the project site to help mitigate flooding. So the map we're looking at right now shows the inundation depths for today's 100-year storm. And just like the maps that Ricky showed earlier, the oranges and yellows, those are the lower levels of inundation, and then the green and purple and blue, those are the deeper levels. This map also shows some of the critical assets that were also described earlier in this presentation. So the first group of assets I want to talk about are the standalone buildings, such as the adult daycare center and the stormwater pump station, since those will be inundated in today's 100-year storm. And deployable options would be preferable in these locations in a perimeter around the buildings, since they would allow for daily access and egress to be maintained. We wouldn't want to put up a line of barriers and people can't get in the building. So I think deployable options would be the best for those locations. And then for larger areas, such as the Mills Avenue and Rice Avenue and the community homes adjacent to these areas, we'd recommend an alignment with a combination of maybe on-site and deployable measures to provide protection. And the benefit of having on-site measures here is that they can also help protect against tidal inundation and everyday flooding, since they will be out there continuously. And then you can supplement at roadways or critical access locations. You can use deployable options to keep those open for everyday use. And the proposed alignments shown in black, pink, and blue are flexible as far as exact location. However, they must start and end at high ground. That's how we maintain a level of protection. And if they are implemented, the area within those alignments will then be protected temporarily. Some additional factors that we also will need to consider for all of these alternatives are implications on drainage. Like Ricky had mentioned before, that's definitely a hot topic. Seepage and soil conditions, since the groundwater is low, and we need to make sure water won't seep under. And further structural analysis if we're looking at attaching any types of deployables to buildings or getting close to building foundations. All right, Aaron, I think we're ready for the next.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, I don't know if I framed it that we're looking at longer term interventions for the end goal, but understanding some of those come with higher cost and design and permitting requirements. So some of these short-term measures are meant to be something more near term, something that the city can take action on sooner as they work toward some bigger projects down the road. So as part of this, we developed a draft beach management plan, which my colleague Tom Touche, who's an environmental scientist and professional wetland scientist, he was the lead author on this, and he'll provide a summary of this draft plan. So Tom.
Thanks, Aaron. The purpose of the beach management plan is essentially to provide near-term and lower-cost actions that could be implemented at Point of Pines, while other longer-term climate resiliency options are being developed. So the beach management plan, it includes 10 general categories of recommended actions. Next slide, please. And so these 10 categories include the following. So the first is establishment and use of a record-keeping system. There's several different ways that records could be kept for this type of a beach management plan, but our general recommendation is that it could be an electronic file, so like an Excel table or a Word file. And basically that could be used to record dates, locations, details of activities performed, the personnel that was involved in performing them, notable storm events and storm-related damage, and other important information. Basically, anything relevant to the beach management plan could be kept as part of the record-keeping system. So it's basically a living document, and it can be continually updated as future activities are performed. The next sort of category recommendations is the monitoring of infrastructure and site conditions. So this is fairly straightforward, but basically includes conducting annual condition surveys of infrastructure elements like seawalls that exist within the site, walkways, sand fence, and basically to identify any damage or deterioration. And then based on the survey, then suggest recommendations for repair or replacement. And then kind of following from that would be routine and periodic maintenance. So I know the Beach Association already does this now, basically periodic removal of man-made trash and debris. So that should definitely continue, as needed. And another category is I'll get into this a little bit more in the next few slides, but the potential closure and then restoration of some of the existing access paths that currently extend off of Rice Avenue now. So that basically involves the closure and restoration of portions of the dune and beach where the access paths currently are to basically better stabilize the dune system against storm events. And next category is sand augmentation. This is also fairly straightforward, but it essentially includes the addition of sand to augment the dunes and the beach at selected locations throughout the management plan area. And also discussed in the management plan is sand fence installation. So this includes adding sand fence in addition to what's already been installed on site, and essentially to help further capture windblown sand and help maintain dune structure. And then another category, this involves more of a kind of construction related type of activity, which is elevated walkways. So rather than have paths at grade that cut through the surface of the dune, elevated walkways are an option to basically allow beach access, but at the same time allow sand to migrate underneath the walkway, which also in turn helps for the establishment of plants and also helps protect plants from being trampled by people that are accessing the beach. And then kind of following and tying a lot of this together is vegetation planning. So this is recommended in selected locations to both help stabilize the dunes and the upper reaches of the beach, since the root system of the plants and the shrubs help to hold sand in place during storm events, while the above ground portions of the plants and shrubs help to slow wind speed as the wind passes above the surface of the dune, which then in turn helps to accrete sand on the dunes and helps to maintain their stability. So basically plants in a way act sort of like a natural snow fence. And the another consideration also is rare species preservation. So the entire beach management plan study area is actually mapped by the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program as estimated in priority habitat. So considerations are included in the beach management plan that also help include rare species. So most of the recommendations that are discussed in the plan will need to be coordinated with NHESP in addition to other agencies. And then the final sort of category of recommendations is public outreach, education, and signage. And I know there's a fair amount of signage that's already out within the management plan area, and I know it's been consolidated, and I think looks a lot better than it has in the past. But one of the additional recommendations that we had was to use potentially use QR codes. So you've probably seen them before. They're the kind of a square looking barcode, and they could be scanned with a smartphone, which again could then link to a website with potentially multiple page tabs. So things like learning about the importance of the dune system, integrity of the dune system, and how that helps prevent storm damage. It could be something that the public could easily learn about. In addition to that, there could also be a tab for how to sign up and become a Point of Pines Beach Association member. So pretty much any addition, any information that you want to relay to the public. It could be as simple as having a QR code, and no flyers need to be actually printed up for that. So there's less trash on the beach also. Next slide, please. So currently every street along Rice Avenue from Wadsworth at the north end all the way down to Chamberlain at the south end has its own beach access path. So this works out to about one access path cutting across the dune every 200 feet. So from a dune stability point of view, just generally speaking, it's better to have larger segments of continuous dune rather than subdivided segments, all the way across the dune itself, because these pathways create opportunities for storm flow incursion as well as destruction of plants. So just very briefly, based on what you could see here in the slide and what the modeling that Ricky was showing earlier, two streets, Delano Ave and Chamberlain, at this point are probably the best options in terms of path closure, with Alden as a potential third, just because it's kind of in that same direction. But out of the other existing pathways that could potentially remain, that would include Wadsworth, Witherby, Bateman, Fowler, Whiten, Lancaster and Bickford. Some of those could potentially be closed as well. Whatever remains open could then have an elevated walkway constructed over the top of the dune. So these are just some options for that type of scenario. And next slide, please. And let's see. And just very briefly, these are segments of some of the maps that are included within the beach management plan area. And they basically show some specific locations where elevated walkways could be constructed, as well as sand added and areas replanted, some sort of unintended pathways restored back to dune condition. And next slide, please. And sort of another similar situation. This is between Fowler and, let's see, I'm trying to read this one here, I think Whiten. Same thing, there are some pathways that have cut across the dune, kind of affects the stability of both the dune as well as the actual, plants that are there. That could be, closed and restored, as well as an area, I think, where there was potential fire from fireworks that could be restored as well. And then next slide, which is actually last slide of this deck. Yeah, so as we saw earlier from the MCFRM map showing the probability of flooding, and then as I was discussing before, Delano and Chamberlain, those two pathways could potentially be closed. And possibly Alden, and the reason is that this portion of the beach is very narrow and it doesn't really provide much in terms of protection from wave runoff and other issues like that. So these recommendations are included in the beach management plan as basically things to consider. So I think that's pretty much what I had.
Thank you, Tom. So there's one last piece that's related to the short-term measures element of the project that we've been working on, and that's recommendations for changes to the city's existing emergency response plan that takes into considerations some of the coastal issues that have been identified in the sea level rise and flooding. So Amanda Shanahan, who's a water resources engineer in our team, will talk to this slide. Amanda? Oh, you're on mute, Amanda.
Sorry. Thanks, Aaron. So we just went through the emergency response plan. That was a dual document plan. And these plans just included kind of the emergency response decisions that the city would make in an upcoming or acute emergency. And a lot of that was the evacuation or shelter in place decision. And we also took into consideration the flooding in the Point of Pines area and just made recommendations for these plans in case of a storm event that maybe consider the shelter in place notice or the evacuation notice go out sooner to these communities, or just a review of that decision, because in a storm event, these people would be potentially or most likely cut off from the rest of the city. So in that sense, they wouldn't be able to evacuate, or just other measures would have to be taken, or they would have to evacuate somewhere else. So just to recommendations to keep those things in mind for these plans. But that's all I had.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. So we will keep on moving through. I know we are going a little longer than I think we had planned for some of these topics, so we'll try to catch up a little bit of time here. But the next topic we're moving on to is another task in the study, which is development of a coastal resilience toolkit, which Kira is going to come back and talk more to now.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Yes, so as Aaron just stated, we looked at temporary options, and now we're moving forward and looking at what type of permanent options or permanent adaptation measures that we can consider to create this resilience toolkit to provide. So we have divided the permanent adaptation measures into 3 categories: structural, non-structural, and nature-based adaptation. So some of the structural measures that we're considering are flood storage area creation, bioretention basins, green infrastructure, impervious surface removal, coastal and offshore structures, pump stations, elevating roadways, elevating, relocating, or flood-proofing buildings, and of course the riverfront master plan. For the nature-based section, we're looking at beach and dune protection and erosion control, wetland and habitat preservation, and living shorelines. And for the non-structural section, we're looking at land acquisition, public education, evacuation procedures, and local building and zoning codes. And once we look at all of the different measures that we are considering for this toolkit, in the final MEP report, we'll be making an assessment of these measures and where we think they work best for the project. And so some of the screening criteria for the feasibility assessment that we're looking at are relative cost, funding opportunities, ownership, community acceptance, conservation restriction requirements, permitting requirements, responsible parties, structural requirements, and of course the design criteria.
Great. So this is one of the items that we're hoping to kind of loop back on when we get into our discussion. This is something that we're just getting into right now as far as lining up and confirming the criteria to apply to the longer term measures that we're looking at. So this is kind of what we've come up with as our team and, you know, in discussions. And so we wanted to present that to the group here tonight and see if there are other thoughts, suggestions, considerations that we may want to take into play when we actually do the ranking and looking at the different intervention measures. So we'll hopefully be able to come back to that. I just wanted to kind of close out in a couple more slides here, our formal presentation, and we gave you a lot of information. So just a quick recap. We started off by kind of showing you kind of the past studies and ongoing studies. There's been a lot of work that's been done here for the city of Revere and for the study area in particular. And all that material is really informing this project. As Ricky was mentioning, there's areas along the Pines River, along the west and northern shoreline near the Point of Pines Yacht Club. Those are the most vulnerable to storm surge and really visibly lose their ability to provide flood risk reduction as sea level levels rise in the future, as you were seeing in the mapping that we shared. There are short-term can be implemented to provide some relief in the near future as longer term measures are looked at. So there are kind of multi-phases to this process. And again, just wanted to land on and kind of mention this with that regional project that the Corps touched on, that the city can only do so much by itself. And some of these issues, you know, climate change, it needs to be dealt with at more of a macro scale and regional scale. So coordinating with the neighboring communities and looking at some things at more of a regional scale is definitely encouraged as well. Just a snapshot of our project schedule. I have an arrow showing approximately where we are in the overall life of this project. We're having our second workshop here tonight. We've kind of wrapped up or are wrapping up the early tasks, and we'll be moving into the next ones here shown in the schedule, with ultimately the project coming to a conclusion by the end of June this year. And the next steps, we'll have the third and final stakeholder workshop, where we'll be presenting the findings from the Task 4 Coastal Resilience Toolkit, which Kira shared some of tonight. Also looking at the findings of the assessment of the feasibility of the coastal resilience options, again, applying those criteria to the options that have been identified. And then giving an update on kind of how we're stitching everything together, the feasibility report, including the implementation plan. So that concludes the formal part of our presentation. We're right about at 7 o'clock. We were hoping to kind of use the remaining part of this meeting, which if you are able to hang on with us for some time here, we're available for at least the next half hour. to kind of hear your questions, respond to things that you may have to ask us, and also hear any other feedback. Before I turn it open for open discussion, I guess, Elle, do you have any concluding remarks?
Aaron, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Ricky and Kara and Tom and Amanda. And I would also like to thank Donnie Charmello, who's also joined the call. He is our Chief Infrastructure Manager in the city, and he was a very early champion of the Point of Pines Beach dune building, if you will. Donnie, feel free to jump in if you'd like. We wouldn't have any beach grass there if it wasn't for his efforts that transpired many years ago. So thank you for your early vision to protect the community. I also just wanted to mention that Steve Miller is also on the call with us from Mass DOT, and he's been an integral part of developing the flood risk models. So I'd like to say thank you for the work that you've done to be able to put us in this position to see what the predictions are. And with that, we do have some hands raised for some questions. So first, I'd like to call in Bob O'Brien.
Thank you, Elle. First of all, thank you for a very comprehensive and thoughtful and thoroughly scary presentation. I presume all of those were intended. Just a couple of observations. I was very glad to see the reference to some of the elements of the riverfront master plan. As you know, or many people know, some of the people on this call were involved in that. There was a very significant resiliency component to that. And the slides that you showed at the beginning will be very different after the riverfront master plan is implemented, particularly along the shoreline. But they also include some very interesting stormwater management strategies, particularly stormwater retention strategies, that I think could be directly related to what it is that this group comes up with in terms of recommendations. And I think if each of these initiatives can leverage the other, that would be helpful. Certainly in the Riverfront District Master Plan, we reference the MVP study as looking at larger and longer term solutions. But if we can integrate these two, I think it would be to the benefit of both the MVP and the Riverfront Master Plan concept. And I would almost make that somewhat of a criteria if we can leverage them. Secondly, there are a couple of other things that are arguably assets of the area that I think perhaps would benefit from a little more attention. One is the reconstruction of the General Edwards Bridge. I don't know how that can be integrated with resiliency, climate change, stormwater surge, etc. I mean, to me, it's always been an interesting option to consider how the bridge might incorporate the Seagate proposal, the sort of regional Army Corps. But beyond that, if we're going to spend this kind of money on a major structure that's crossing a major inlet, it seems to me we have to start thinking about what other purposes it serves beyond transportation. I don't know exactly what they are, and there are people on this phone call who have a better idea, but not to consider that possibility, I think would be overlooking an opportunity which we are not well advised to overlook given what we're facing. The third thing, on a somewhat smaller scale, but I think equally important and perhaps even more relevant locally, we're building a new fire station. That fire station is going to be built, obviously, as all new buildings are, to contemporary floodplain standards and so forth. But whether it's the structure itself or the equipment and staff that will be in that station, it seems to me we ought to look at how that can support and leverage what it is that we are proposing. I know the fire department has talked about high water vehicles, for example, in that station. And perhaps the station itself can include other types of equipment. And when I think about the recommendations that you were making with regard to city policies, evacuation and so forth, the location and the potential equipping and staffing of that fire station, it seems to me, should play a real role in what it is that we are recommending, particularly what we're recommending to the city. So I think it's an excellent presentation you've done, and I think it's charting a course to prevent some very serious consequences, but I would just encourage us taking all of our assets into account, from the riverfront master plan to the reconstruction of the bridge to the new fire station. Well done.
Thank you, Bob. And just to echo what Bob was saying in regards to some of the resiliency measures that were introduced with the riverfront master plan. So he was referring to, for Gibson Park specifically, we spoke about potential for underground storage in the field. So that's something that it wouldn't alleviate all of the flooding on Mills Ave, nor maybe a portion of it, but it would compensate for some of it. So that, in conjunction with some other long-term resiliency measures that can be identified here through the study, the two could work hand in hand to really provide some resiliency benefit to the riverside, and specifically Mills Ave, which is inundated with flooding on a regular basis. They also, the potential acquisition of the boatyard, which is also another area that experiences repetitive flooding. So those other items are also incorporated in the master plan and will be molded into the study as well, for consistency purposes. And just to note that the engineers on this project have had conversations and had meetings with the engineers on the riverfront master plan. So they're both on the same page, so to speak. So thank you for taking the time to do that, incorporating the two projects together. And I believe we have Steve Miller has his hand raised. So Steve Miller, can unmute yourself.
So am I on live here?
You are on live.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Robert's comments were great. And I just wanted to point out that the coastal model has a number of scenarios: present day, 2030, 2050, 2070, and perhaps 2100. That gives the city the chance to prioritize what they want to do at various time steps. So it's not necessary to plan for 2100, but you plan for 2050 and 2070. And so you don't have that capital expenditure, that enormous capital expenditure up front for planning for the future. And I just want to point out that things can change. So just keep that in mind as the city prepares its budget, and keep in mind regional approaches, like Aaron pointed out, to how various neighboring communities are approaching this. This was a great presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your feedback and your comments. I would like to point out that we are actually very interested in forming a regional working group. We'll be submitting an application at the end of this week for additional bandwidth to allow us to coordinate with Saugus, Lynn, Malden, Revere, and Everett. So the 5 communities together. As Aaron mentioned, decades ago when we were on the road with Army Corps of Engineers, and many years of study, planning, and design were discussed. There were a number of stakeholder meetings, including state agencies, residents, and so forth. So we'd like to revisit that opportunity And like I said, we've been in discussion with all 5 communities together, and we will be submitting a grant for support to reestablish a regional working group for this region. And I'd like to call upon Donnie, and then I have also Eric Lampendecchio following him. Donnie?
Hi, Al. It's Don Charamella, 215 Rice Ave. I'm very impressed with the presentation. I wish, I kind of tuned in a lot sooner. I know you had a couple of workshops, but, it's funny. I'd like to share some of the pictures. I'll send them to Al about what this place looked like 30 years ago after the storm of 91, when Rice Ave and the beach were the same elevation. And the species that you see down here were not native. They probably were native to this area, a couple of 100 years ago. But what we did was we planted this bayberry, Rosa rugosa, beach plum, American beach grass. We planted it, and it took because it was never here. And I can associate with the comments that you made about the access ways, because 30 years ago, outside of everybody's front door, they had an access to the beach. So there were hundreds of paths going to the beach instead of one at the end of every side street. When the beach association, we built the stairs to just direct people one way to stop trampling the vegetation. But that's when the vegetation was just starting to take seed. But now we have what we have. But now the ocean levels are reaching the top of the dunes again, which is amazing to me. But what we've been doing, we have a pump station, the Point of Pines pump station that was noted in the meeting. But that station was constructed in 1966. I've been taking proposals for upgrading the pump station to bring it into the 21st century, because those pumps are pretty antiquated and they're very slow to pump. But it's one of the things that keeps the Point of Pines that's able to evacuate stormwater quickly. We have 2 Morse Fairbanks turbine pumps in that station now. They do move about 400,000 gallons an hour each one, but we're out to bid to design a new pump station in that same area to upgrade the pumps to high-speed submersibles, so that we can evacuate the seawater when it does crest, or when it does hit the streets, because it just goes right into a drainage. So that's something that we've been working on, and it wasn't really related to this. It's just something that we noted that needed to be done, and probably needs to be done with the Riverside too, something to that effect, some sort of pump station. But we need drainage there to collect it. But very impressed with the presentation, and I'm like to be a part of it.
Thank you, Donnie. I'd like to call upon Eric Lampendecchio, who's had his hand raised.
Hi, good evening. Eric Lampendecchio, 43 Tapley Avenue. I just want to take a moment and thank all of you for your participation in this project. Flooding in that area, it's really a now problem. And I grew up on the Mills Ave area, and it's worse now than I've ever seen before. We have, high tides and occasional storms where you can't even get down that area. And I really just want to thank all of you for spending your time and volunteering your hours and dedication to this project. It's so important to the long-term viability of that neighborhood. And it's so important to the residents down there and keeping that neighborhood above water. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you for joining us, Eric. Robert O'Brien?
Thank you again, Elle. One other observation as I was listening to all of the comments and questions. Obviously, what was portrayed early on about the potential for inundation involves a tremendous, human, social, physical cost, but it also obviously involves a tremendous financial cost. And it occurs to me, and we've already seen this, as Frank knows, in certain areas of Revere, homeowners insurance rates are already going through the roof because of this kind of problem. And I'm just wondering whether there might be any possibility, since we are in Revere sort of at ground zero for this problem, that when we come up with some interesting recommendations, we might be able to recruit the insurance industry to begin to, finance some of these initiatives to see whether they can't prevent some of the kind of losses that they're going to be suffering along with the rest of us as we go through. I mean, their potential casualty loss is measured in the billions. And if they could do something interesting here on a relatively small scale by their standards, we might be able to try something really expensive that they may be able to participate in. And, they've got a lot of money, and we could certainly use some of it. And it just occurs to me, maybe if we recruit them early on, we could all join hands on this.
Thank you, Bob. I agree entirely. I also have Donnie with his hand raised.
Nope, that wasn't me. Sorry.
No? Okay.
No, that was before. That was before.
Okay.
You have to lower your hand, Donnie.
It's okay, I'll lower it. There you go. We're all set. And Ryan is all set. And I have Jack Polcari from the Point of Pines Beach Association with a question or comment. Jack?
Hear me? Hear me?
Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't know you could hear me.
There you go. We can hear you now.
Thanks. I want to thank Donnie for all the work he did. First of all, we're reminded that Donnie was instrumental in the planting of the seagrass, which continues to propagate, I think, really, really well. And that's one of the things that I would like to track with year-to-year photography here at the Beach Association. From my position in the beach, it's unclear what the Beach Association will have to pay for versus the city. That's something that doesn't concern this particular presentation. Going back to the draft beach management plan, I see three things that sort of jump out as low cost, immediate things. Clearly the elevated walkways are going to be pretty expensive and would be borne by the Beach Association, but the beach sand fencing, vegetation planting, and closures of walkway closures. I'd like to know, and I think it was Tom Touche, the beach fencing. When we're talking about the sort of, are we indeed talking about the sort of zigzag dune creating sand fencing facing at the dune edge of the existing dune? So that's sort of question one. And vegetation planting, I'm not sure there's anything else we can do. I think the vegetation seems to be propagating very well, and in sort of a year by year tracking would help see where that's going. And the last thing is closures of the entryways. I happen to live on Chamberlain Ave, and it doesn't appear to be where the sand has pretty much washed up to the level of the seawall. It's I'd like to know how we would close. Essentially is a grade level entryway to the beach, and because that's the end of the Beach Association's property. Anything to the right, I don't see how who would have control over access to the. I assume that the seawall at that point is property of the city. That's city property, and that's where the line of demarcation would be. Just curious.
Sure.
But other than that, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jack, this is Aaron. Tom Touche, unfortunately, he had a Conservation Commission hearing,
Okay.
so he had to leave the workshop a little early, but I can speak to some of the questions that you had. With regarding the sand fencing, I know that the association has put out some existing fencing. Elle has recently sent along some photographs showing us the location. It's our hope for
knocked off.
Final plan to kind of update the mapping that we had with the proposed location of the additional fencing to take advantage of what's there right now. But as you were saying, with kind of orienting it and kind of instead of the perpendicular paths to the beachway, making it more of an angle and having some bends to help minimize the effects of kind of flow paths or kind of the erosion nature of things going on. So that's kind of a work in progress, getting a little bit refined, but there are going to be some proposed alignments included in the beach plan that the association can consider. And vegetation, I agree, the plantings there that I guess we're going to credit Donnie for 30 years ago putting things in. It's been doing great. There have been a couple areas that it looks like there could be some replantings and some modest improvements. And the closures, the three that were highlighted were really at the crosshairs of the most at risk for kind of that potential future overtopping and wave action in that area, just the way that it is oriented against the shoreline. And I agree, I've been out on the beach and I've seen where the sand's kind of built up and is kind of going over the seawall. So how do you close some of those areas? I guess that would be in tandem with potentially further building out and elevating some of the dune structures further shoreward, ocean side, to help build up the overall integrity of the structure there. So understanding that beach access is an important thing for the residents there. And these are suggestions, recommendations, and something that I think will need to be looked at more closely by the association to make the right decisions.
I think the other option and the other recommendation that we also need to look at while we're considering plantings is on slides 26 and 27 and 28, where there are areas that do need some beach renourishment with sand to fill in some of the divots, and over time that's where the water has found its way through to the street. So just prioritizing what areas would need to be done renourished before replanting. So that's something that we should also incorporate into the plan as far as priority and the logistics of that. We have Bob O'Brien and then we have Donnie.
Yeah, I would just like to suggest, early on it was mentioned, Aaron, that we need to document our progress. And Jack and Donnie's comments brought to mind that beyond the Excel spreadsheet that was referred to, photographic documentation, especially in the era of drones, kind of a time-lapse recording of how we are doing is probably quite feasible, cost-effective, and maybe even dramatizing some of our more traumatic climate events, storm events, etc. We should probably build that into the strategy.
I would agree, Bob. And I think that most of us that live in the Pines, we do have some older photographs, aerial photographs, so we can really sort of piece together in chronological order the transformation of the beach. We have some aerial photos before the dunes were planted. I know that Donnie has some additional photos as well. So I think it would be a really interesting project for the Beach Association to be able to begin that record keeping currently, and then look back historically, because we do have a number of people in the area still residing there for decades that that may be able to inform that. And with that, I'd like to call on Donnie again.
So, listening to everybody, thank you, Jack. All right, thank you for those comments. But, being a Pines resident, I can't really concern myself with just the Pines. I think the Pines is pretty well kind of off and running. We kind of have a good base to work with. There is some work to do. Like I had said about the pump station, we have to bring that up to the 21st century, put in some new high-speed pumps to evacuate water a little faster. But if it does get into the streets, it goes into the drainage, and we do have the ability to pump it out as quickly as it can, almost as quickly as it can come in. Right now, we put some new isolation gates on those two pumps. We put some new backflows on them. We're going to be putting a new flapper gate on the 36-inch gravity line that discharges out into the ocean. So, we've brought that station up, and with the wall on the riverside, on the Rice Ave side going down along the river, the Army Corps had given me the okay to start making repairs to the segmented walls, the wall that's there. There's probably about at least 10 or so sections that are deteriorating. They gave me the go ahead to create a form and form in place each one of those segments that have deteriorated. But my concern really is, being a city employee is really with the Riverside, because that is where I see on a daily event, a daily high tide where it's really impacted the most. Now these king tides are more common, and the flooding is so common down there. It's not like a monthly event. It's almost like a daily event down there. So my concern is really with the Riverside now, and what we can do as far as a permanent in place wall or whatever around that community, because that's really the most vulnerable. I think as far as the Pines is concerned, there's definitely some tweaking we can do, but the Riverside is, I think, where our most attention is, where we need to create a wall like similar to what we have down the Pines. We can't have a dune, but we can have a wall, and we can certainly put a pump station in place, which we have none right now. So maybe that's something we can talk about.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Frank Stringy, city planner. One thing that comes to mind, having lived in the Pines for many years myself during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and experienced a lot of those storms, is our cleanup efforts. And we're seeing more and more of that sand coming onto our right-of-ways and our streets. And I think part of this report, we should include increasing our equipment capacity for storm cleanup. It's becoming more and more of a problem. I know Donnie has to live with it. Between the Riverside on Mills Avenue and Rice Avenue, a lot of debris, especially on Rice Ave. Sand is becoming more and more of a problem, the roadways. And so maybe have a section in here as part of our MVP is storm cleanup equipment capacity to help the city get these areas back the way they were much quicker as we see more increasing storms.
It's okay. I would like to call on Loretta LaCentra, resident from the Riverside.
Thank you, Elle. I wanted to thank everybody that's been working so hard on this project. It's obviously very important to me living in the Riverside, Point of Pines as well. So thank you to everybody that's putting in the time and the effort. I just wanted to thank Donnie also for his comments about the Riverside. Looking at the proposals, I didn't see a lot that we could effectively use on this side. We don't have a seawall. We don't have walkways. We don't have vegetation. So we're very vulnerable in this neighborhood, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what solutions we can come up with this studies. So thank you.
Loretta, thank you. I'm also interested in hearing, which we will probably take, into a much deeper conversation offline following this meeting, but just to talk a little bit about the temporary deployable options that we may have in the interim while we're coming up with a longer term solution that can be implemented. I think there are a lot of solutions that were presented, and talking with the city engineers and the planning department and finding out budget wise, what makes the most sense. I think that we'll probably get into a deeper dive on that following this meeting, as well as trying to find funding opportunities for long-term solutions. And with that, we're right about at 7:30. I have one last hand raised, so I'm gonna call upon Steve Miller. I'm gonna ask you, just be cognizant we are at 7:30 now, and please, I'd like to invite you for your last comment before we wrap up.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So when it comes to deployables, please consider who can deploy the materials, because people can assume certain things, but when it comes to actually deploying something during an emergency, they can't do it, and they often rely, I should say, on contractors. So please keep that in mind, because during an emergency, everyone is doing everything.
It's so true.
So
true. And I'm sure Johnny will attest to having capacity. And
oh yeah.
is definitely a big ask. So it needs to go hand in hand with, not just having it, but being able to implement it as well.
Yep. That's
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. Very good point.
Donnie knows.
That's right. So with that, I really like to thank everybody for joining us this evening and taking the time out of your evening life with your families and just, your time off. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate all your comments and feedback. I just briefly let you know that all of the documents, the drafts in the next coming week will be posted on revere.org. So if you do want to comment in writing, if you didn't have an opportunity to comment on something this evening, you can email those comments directly to me, and we'll discuss them as a team and implement whatever we can into the final iterations. As Aaron mentioned, our next public meeting will be held in May, and that will be right before we wrap up the project. And we will have one more partner meeting before then, and we'll probably have an internal staff meeting before then, once or twice before then as well. All of the information here will also be folded into our hazard mitigation plan. If everybody's really interested in this information, feel free to join us. Our hazard mitigation public meeting will be on March 3rd at 6 p.m. The link is located on the city calendar. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to Aaron. Do you have any final comments?
Just really appreciated the dialogue and the attention and feedback from everyone. And again, the time that you are giving to this is much appreciated. So thank you all.
So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Feel free to check out the website if you want to look at any of these in greater detail with the more robust draft documents. And if you do have comments, you can provide those in writing to me via email. And I look forward to seeing you at workshop number 3. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you, Elle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.